Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
We've been going through the, sound like somebody's really excited, and going through the life of Moses, and I think there's a lot of things we can learn from when we look at it. I noticed the ladies were sitting around a little deal, talked about I don't know prayer. Some of you were reading it, you get the different ones, I don't know. And that can all be said about a lot of us. A lot of us we don't really know. When we pray to the Lord, don't really understand. But it ends with basically you have to have faith to trust Him. But I'd like to do a little bit of addressing a little bit of that. Would you agree that God's ways are not always our ways? In fact, most of the time it seems like they're not. And also you stop and you think about it when you look in the book of Exodus, chapter 19 and following. The second thread that goes through there, I think it's often is you hear on the radio a lot, the greatest generation. You hear the greatest generation talking about the one that's, from World War II and so on. You also hear a lot about the greatest nation to ever exist. They talk about the United States and everything. But I wouldn't agree with that per se. Because I believe what you have, when you think about the greatest generation or the greatest nation, A.W. Tozer, and I know Grady has read it, so wrote a book, a fine book entitled Knowledge of the Holy. A small book, I read it about 50 years ago. But in the front of it, early in the book, he makes this statement. No generation rises higher than their view of God. How high is the view of God in our country today? And I think it's important when we stop and think about it. And you're going to find that the same thing is going to happen with Israel today in Exodus 19. What does God want from Israel? And what does God want from me? Let's see what does He want from Israel in the preliminary. So let's look at, first of all, what does He want from Israel? In chapter 18, if you remember, we left last week the division of responsibility. And if you remember, Jethro saw Moses trying to do everything by himself, and it wasn't working. And people were obviously standing all day, and he was wearing himself out. But if you look at verse 23, it kind of helps lead into the following chapters. Exodus 18 and verse 23, and Jethro is speaking to Moses, and he says, if you will do this thing, how about the division of responsibility, and God so commands you, you make it. So I think it's interesting. This is my suggestion, but you have to then say, what does God want? Chapter 19, God starts to tell you what He wants. And so let's think about that, the place. What does God want? Notice in chapter 19 and verse 1 and 2, it says in the third month. So they've only been gone from Egypt 3 months. Have very many things happened in those 3 months? You think about it. You have obviously the crossing of the sea, the great miracle, going without food in the miracle, going without water in the miracle. You've had a lot of amazing things happen in 3 months. And notice what it says there. They're in the land of Egypt, and the very day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. And you'll notice in the end of verse 2, they camped in the wilderness. There Israel camped in front of the mountain. And notice the mountain being what? The Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. Go back to Exodus chapter 3. And what does it tell us in chapter 3? You remember Moses went in the burning bush? He was at this location. It says wilderness. It's not a desert per se, but if you've been to western Colorado, you have to have how many acres to graze one cow, just how desolate it is. But you have similar type of terrain here. They do it. There's a lot of grazing that would take place. The wide open. At the plain, it was an area that's 2.5 miles by 1/2 mile, so you could have the people who would be there. You'll also find, remember, God promised Moses at the burning bush in verse 12 of chapter 3, you're going to go to Egypt, You're going to bring the children of Israel back, and you're going to be and worship God at this mountain. So notice God's doing exactly what he says. So they're at the mountain, and they're about to meet the Lord. How many times does Moses go up on the mountain and come down? Okay, a lot of people will say 3. You ever wondered how many times? You ever wondered how far that is? 7,500 feet. Granted, roughly 7.5 miles up and down. Okay, how long is that going to take you? When you read Exodus 19 through 35, you're going to find he went up 7 times. Why did he have to go up 7 times? And how would you feel? God, this is getting kind of old. Why don't you just tell me everything you want to tell me on the first trip? He didn't always go alone either. He brings different groups with him that needed to be up there. Sometimes it's alone, and sometimes there's different groups. Let's look a little bit about it, the place. But I think it's interesting. You heard, some of you might have seen it's a really good movie called The Prayer Room. How many of you have a place where you meet God? This is where Moses met God earlier, and it's where the children of Israel are about to meet. Where do you go to meet God? And I think it's interesting when you ask the question. Notice there's preparation. If you knew you were going to meet God today, would you have done something different? Seriously. If you were told you're going to meet God at Dalton Hill tomorrow, would you have done something different? If you say yes, what does Matthew 18 tell us? Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, what?
There will be also.
Is he here? So think about it. Let's look at the preparation that he first wants them to do. Notice in verse 3 and 4, this is the first time Moses went up to God, went up the mountain. Again, you're thinking about that. The terrain is called a moderate to severe type of hike. Going up granite, up that high. You think about it, almost 8 miles, 7.5 miles. How many of you want to go hiking in the mountain 7.5 miles? Remember how old is Moses? Now, one thing he had is, remember, God gave him his strength, even as his youth. So he goes up. Notice the first thing he wants them to remember, the mountain. Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel. Notice what he says. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. First thing he wants them to do is remember who God is and what he's done. It's an interesting term. He says, I bore you like eagle's wings. What does that mean? When a little eaglet is born, when it goes to fly, what's the mama doing? Flying under him. And they go down, they catch him on their wings. And he says, what? These last 3 months, who's been doing this? I've been taking care of you. Have you ever noticed sometimes you wonder, I've heard it how many times, man, when I was young, I'd pray and the Lord would answer me, he'd do all these things, and it's just right there. And now it's just, man, I'm waiting a long time. Well, okay. It's like the eaglet. When it grows up, the mama's not there anymore. You're learning to fly on your own. But I think you notice the first thing he says, I want you to tell them, remember what I've done. Notice the second thing he says in verse 5. Now then, if you'll indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the people, for all the earth is mine. The second one, are they willing to obey? Does he tell them what they're going to do? He's wanting them to commit to obedience, and he hasn't told them what all he's going to ask of them. How many of us are saying, well, Lord, you tell me what you want, and then I'll tell you whether I'll do it or not. Isn't that what he said to Abraham? Go to the land that I'll show you. Acts 13, set apart for me Paul and Barnabas for the work that I have. Does he tell them all they're going to do? No. Notice the third thing that I think is interesting in verse 6. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the sons of Israel. So the third thing, I want you to be a mediator. They're supposed to be a mediator to who? To the other nations. Are you and I in 1 Peter not called priests and mediators as Christians today? So notice then, you're supposed to go tell the sons of Israel. So notice in verse 7, he comes down the mountain. All right, he went up. He comes down and basically says what? Hey, he's been taking care of you. Remember these things? Are you willing to now follow the Lord? And so on. They answer, obviously they say, yes, we are. So now he brings the answer back up the mountain to tell God they're willing. And now God's then going to say, okay, they're willing. Now I want you to do this. And he comes back down the mountain again. Keeps making trip up and down, up and down. Notice the fourth thing then in verse 19. If you notice, the people answering, hey, all the Lord has spoken to you will do. So Moses brought the word back to the Lord. So he's back up on the mountain again. And like I said, this isn't just walking across the street. You think about the trip up and the trip down. The trip up and the trip down. And I'm sure if you and I would probably say, Lord, why don't you just ask all you want, and I'll make one trip up, one trip down. But notice how obedient he was. Notice what he tells him then, the next thing. The Lord says to him in verse 9 to Moses, behold, I shall come to you in a thick cloud in order that the people may hear. When I speak with you, then they will also believe in you forever. Then Moses told the words of the Lord to the people. So now Moses has done what? He's come back down again. He has to tell the people. Okay, so notice I think it's interesting. He wants them to remember what he's done. He wants them to be willing to obey. He wants them to be mediators to other nations. He wants them to be sensitive to what God has to say. How sensitive are we to what God has to say? I think it's interesting. I think a lot of times we're not because we have too many distractions, too many things. Notice then he also tells them, notice interesting in verse 10 that what he wants. The Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments. And let them be ready on the third day. For the third day the Lord will come down on the mountain on the side of the people. Okay, notice they're told to consecrate themselves. How many days are they supposed to do it? 2 days. So for 2 days you're supposed to be contemplating what? Your life and consecration. Most of us, how much concentrate, how much, are consecrating of ourselves have we done before we come to meet the Lord at church or prayer room or whatever? It's also interesting, it says wash your garments. 2 million people are supposed to wash their garments to meet the Lord the next day. What kind of area are you in? You think about it, it's obviously a desert type of area, and you're thinking of water and everything else, and you're saying every person is to wash their garments before they meet me. They need to be clean spiritually, and they need to be clean exteriorly when they come to meet me. It's interesting when you look at it. You find the same thing in which Moses does, and so he goes up. He's told to do that. In 14, he comes down and tells him to do what he's to consecrate themselves and so on. It's also interesting in verse 12 when he says, "Set boundaries around so the people will not come to the mountain nor touch it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned and shot through, whether beast or man. Nothing can come close." So you put a boundary around the mountain. So Moses has to come down and tell them. So they do this. Third day, notice then what happens is Moses goes down and he tells them, he gets all ready. And notice, I think it's interesting why they have not only consecrated themselves, but they're also wanting to have respect and reverence for God. You find that in verse 21 and 22, because when he does come down, you're going to find it. Notice what happens. You find Moses comes down in verse 17, and then notice in verse 20, the Lord came down on the mountain, and the Lord, in verse 20, calls Moses to do what? Come back up. Now, how many of them, when you think about this, let's look at this description in verse 16 and so on. Now it came about on the third day, in the morning, there was thunder and lightning, flashes, and a thick cloud upon the mountain. And a very loud trumpet sounded that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses brought the people out of camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, God Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. The Lord came down on the mountain, the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to come up. You ready to go up? Seriously, you think about it. Everybody is trembling and everything else, and you think about this, and God says to come up. And how many of us are going to be willing to go up? In fact, turn over to Hebrews 12. Let's look at what it says in Hebrews 12. And we can easily understand this in Hebrews chapter 12. Notice in verse 20, it starts all the way up in verse 18. It talks about this. It talks about it, the adventure that they had in verse 20. They cannot bear the command. If even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I'm full of fear and trembling. I can imagine. How many of you would be scared to death? God wants to have a healthy respect for Him. And how many today have a healthy respect for God? I mean, seriously, do we really have a healthy respect for God? I think the language would greatly change with what people do today if they did. But notice He wants them to have that healthy respect. So when you stop and think about it again, the preparation to meet God, they're preparing the meeting. And notice, first of all, remember what He's done. He comes down and tells them. Then He goes back up and they're willing to obey. They said they are. They're then told you're going to be mediators. You're told to then consecrate themselves. You're told to listen to what God says. You're told also then to be respectful in His presence. And I think it's important for all of us. Just think of these different trips that He has. He comes down. So He's on the top in verse 20. Notice in verse 21. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and said, go down. You just got up to the top. And now God says what? Go back down. And the reason He says to go back down is because you don't want people to come up. And notice, and with the priests, and let all the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, but I'll just warn us, saying, let's set boundaries about the mountain and consecrate. Notice 24, the next trip. He's going back down. The Lord said to him, go down and come up again, you and Aaron with you, but do not let the priests or the people break through. So who's supposed to come up on the next one? Aaron is. You notice it's interesting if you go then, the reason for the purpose of the meeting, one was to have a healthy respect for what God says and what He's doing. You find that, go over to chapter 24, He's given the law. Go over to chapter 24 and notice in verse 9. Remember He called Aaron to come up? And notice in verse 9, Moses, 24:9, Moses went up with Aaron, and notice his two sons. They were the two oldest who were to be priests, and the 70 elders. They go up, and they get the different things that they have. And I think it's interesting what they have. This is when they get it, and they then come back down. Why did God want them? Because they're the ones who are going to have to implement so much of the instructions that He's given the priests that were supposed to. So why did God have the meeting? One is to have a healthy respect. Two is He wants them, in verse 12, you notice then, in chapter 24, the Lord said to Moses, come up to me and the mountain remain there, and I'll give you the stone tablets with the law and commandments which I've written for their instruction. So one reason you have the meeting is to gain a healthy respect for God. Second reason is to have the written word. He writes it out for them. What happens then on the third one, you stop and you think about it, what happened to that? Remember Moses stays up there 40 days? And in the meantime, you have the golden calf. And Aaron was already up there and he comes down and he doesn't do what he should have done. And when they go back up there to get it, who went up with him to get it? You ever notice who went up with him? Look at him. Who's that? Joshua does. Yes. So Aaron had gone up to come back down. Now you have Joshua that goes up with him. And Joshua goes up with him. If you remember, when they were coming down, you remember you heard they hear the noise, and Joshua said there's war in the camp. God says no, it's not. Moses says no, it's not war. It has to do with, obviously, they're having the orgy and everything else that was going to go, and that's when Moses throws the 10 Commandments down. Because in a sense, did they not break the 10 Commandments? You think about it, you have this great experience. God's done all these things for you. You've consecrated yourselves. You do all this. Moses goes up to get it. You've seen the mountain. You've seen anybody that crosses it gets killed. And Moses is gone 40 days, and you've already forgot all those things. And you go back to the life that you had before. And God then, Joshua, why would God want Joshua to go up one time? Who takes Moses' place? And Joshua 1, remember, we're told what? Let not the words of the law depart from thy mouth. Joshua was there, the lower place on the mountain, but he was there when God gave the law. So you think about it, he goes, on the last trip, Joshua's with him when they break him up. Moses goes back the last time to get it. Remember, he's told to bring tablets, and God writes it a second time. So you have 7 trips that he's going up and down, up and down. I think it's interesting when you think about it. How many of us are prepared to meet God? No, seriously. Do we agree that we can meet Him today? Can the rapture happen today? Yes. Could I die today and we're going home or whatever? So am I ready to meet Him? That's why, by the way, if you notice, it's interesting, the third reason, which I didn't give you, in chapter 25, let's just look at it, the reason they're having a meeting, doing these up and down. And notice in 25, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, tell the sons of Israel to raise a contribution for me. From every man whose heart moves him, he shall raise a contribution. Remember, they had the things they got from Egypt. And notice then in verse 8, let them construct a sanctuary for me, that I may dwell among them, according to all I'm going to tell you, as a pattern of the tabernacle, a pattern of its furniture, thus you shall construct it. According to Hebrews, the tabernacle they're constructing was like the tabernacle where? In heaven. Okay, so we notice that when Moses is going up and down, he's preparing the people to be ready. He's bringing them the instructions that God gives them in the law. He's bringing them instructions on the tabernacle they are to build. That's why they are here for 11 months. That's also why you'll notice it's an answer to Jethro's deal. Divide responsibilities, but also if God shows you to do this, which God does. Now think about it. What's our sanctuary? According to 1 Corinthians 6, your body is a temple of what? Okay, how holy is our sanctuary? You stop and think about it. How holy is our sanctuary? God has this set apart. And how holy is it? So you think about it, they were so scared and everything else. If God did this to you and I today, what would happen? Think about it in Isaiah. He meets God in Isaiah chapter 6. And he says, woe is me, what? For I am a man of unclean lips, and I'm among a nation of unclean people. How many of us feel that way? We are a nation of unclean people, no question. And we're unclean lips. Notice that God then takes a coal and cleanses him. And then in verse says what? Who will go for me, and here am I, send me. Could it possibly be that we're not hearing what God wants us to do because we haven't consecrated ourselves to be ready? God did not give them the instructions until they consecrated themselves. And it's interesting. Most of us remember when we were a kid, we all dressed up in church. You had church clothes, and then you had your regular clothes. And every Saturday night we had to polish our shoes. Those shoes and those clothes were only for church. Part of that's coming from this. You stop and think about it. They're wanting to prepare to meet God. But you and I can meet God at any place. But how prepared are we to meet Him? I think it's interesting. So again, why does He have this? Where does God want Israel? He wants them to be a holy nation. God wants you and I to be a holy nation as believers, spiritually, to be mediators between God and man, to lead people to Christ. 1 Peter chapter 2, and then you also have the 2 Corinthians chapter 5. How many of us are wanting to obey? Or how many of us say, I'll obey, but I want to have the final word. I'll do this and I won't do that. How many of us are wanting to consecrate ourselves? How many of us have the proper respect for God that we need? There's no question it's going to happen. Notice in Daniel chapter 5, the Babylonian king was pretty defiant until the handwriting on the wall and what happened to him. He started trembling. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was really something too, until he wandered around as a beast for 7 years. You know, God will get us the respect that He deserves. God resists the proud and gives grace to who? So notice then, preparing, He wants the healthy respect. Communicate the written word. That word is a lamp unto my feet and what? Okay? Do we believe that? So how many of us looked at it this week to see what He wanted, where He wanted us to go, and what He wanted us to do? That's a fair question. Are we not told to study to show ourselves approved, to work we need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth? There is a right way and a wrong way. We have to study it. He also wants us to construct a sanctuary. He's living within us today. How many of us have, what kind of sanctuary is it? Is it one that He is proud to be a part of? Or is it one He's not? So you think about it. I'll give you some questions and the final ones. So He goes up and down 7 times. Up, brings word, brings it back. Their word goes back and forth. Well, think about some questions. In Judges chapter 2 and verse 10, it says the next generation after the conquering of the land did not know God or His works. Why did they not know God or His works? Okay, and why does our nation not know God and His works? It's an interesting question you can ask. God often leads us in steps. He could have told Moses everything in one trip. One step, back, forth. Moses did everything he was told to do every single time. Leads us in steps. He leads, when they went on the missionary journey, they went part of the way, and then God says, don't go there. Acts 16. Go over here. Most of us want it all laid out clearly for what reason. So I then can say yes or no. I think it's interesting. God calls those that He needs at that time. He called Moses when He needed Moses. He called Aaron to be up there when He needed Aaron. He called Joshua up there when He needed Joshua. It says the elders. You ever wonder about Caleb? You ever wonder about Hur? Were they part of the elders, or is that not what God wanted them to do? And Caleb obviously was an incredibly godly man. Don't be jealous about others. We do our job, and if God's calling somebody to do something, let's support him. You find that in Acts 13. There was no jealousy talked about, and they set apart different ones. So let's support those that we have.
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.